Hello class. This is your video about making an outline for the final paper, or at least your first attempt at an outline, because you'll revise it as you go along. First, the outline is not the first thing you do. So you have to do a lot of pre-writing. You have to scribble notes on many pieces of paper. You have to try making bubble maps. You have to try making T-charts. You have to try writing a thesis 6 different ways. You have to scribble out ideas. You have to stare into space. You have to procrastinate, but not too much. So you have to do a lot of work, a lot of thinking work before you make an outline, okay? So the outline is the last thing you do before you write your rough draft. All right, so let's look at this outline template. You do need to hand in your outline in this template. You can mess with it, but use this template. So write your outline in here and then submit in week 13. All right, so you have your action to be morally evaluated. You have your narrow ethical question. You have your tentative thesis. So T for thesis. Tentative means you'll probably revise it, but this is your first try at the thesis. And then your outline, okay? So in the outline, early in the paper, you're going to describe the scenario, background information, setup, definitions, clarification of the issue. This is not all in one paragraph, I don't think. So you're thinking maybe the first couple pages of your essay will include some of these elements. But what elements you need for your paper, that is unique to you. So you really have to think hard about what things you need to set in place before you start making your argument and supporting your thesis. So this part will be different for everybody. And then we have reasons to support your thesis. So T is for thesis, T is correct because, T is correct because. So what reasons will you give? And some of these will be utilitarian arguments. Some will be virtue arguments. Some might just be arguments you have and you're not really sure what kind they are, and that's okay at this point. And of course, you don't know how many you're going to have, but you want to really work on thinking about how you're going to support that thesis. So that's your main argument right there. And then you're going to consider objections and do rebuttals. And you'll do this at least twice in the final paper. For the rough draft, probably one would be fine. Okay, so you're going to anticipate objections to your argument and then think about what your rebuttal will be. How will you answer that objection? Now, here's something important. You don't necessarily have to put your objections at the end of the paper like this. You have options for organizing. Okay? So I'm going to show you a different handout now. Dealing with the opposing side, 3 models for organizing your paper. So you're going to anticipate objections, you're going to do rebuttals, just like we've done in the other papers. And you have to decide where you're going to put these things in your essay. So that's a big decision. So probably you're going to do Model A or Model B on this handout. Okay, Model A, you put all your rebuttals in one part. So you do your main argument first, and then you anticipate, and maybe you'll have 2 or 3 paragraphs where you do this, okay? And then the conclusion is after. But this is like your overall essay, your whole paper, and you decide to do your objections and rebuttals at the end in the last major part. But you don't have to do it that way. Model B is respond as you go. So for each major argument you make, you anticipate an objection and deal with it, kind of in the paragraph right after you make the argument. And then again, for reason 2, the paragraph right after you make the argument. Okay? So probably you'll do Model A or Model B. Model C is all rebuttals. Once in a while, you might write an essay like this, where where responding to some view is really your priority, like you're responding to the opposing side for the whole essay, probably you won't be doing that for this essay. So you should talk to me or Jen if you're considering kind of this model. But probably you're going to do model A or model B, and you can decide what's going to work for your argument. Okay? All right. So now let's go back to the outline template. So again, you're going to submit your rough outline in week 13 using this template, but you get to mess with it, okay? So you don't necessarily have to have A, B, and C. Like you get the general idea, and then you mess with it because you have to make a plan for your unique paper. All right, so speaking of unique papers, we are now going to switch to the article by Anne Barnhill called Just Pushy Enough. And so is your homework to reread this. So here it is. Da, da, da. Just Pushy Enough by Anne Barnhill. So you might pause your video if you need to get out this article and make sure it's fresh in your mind, okay? Because I'm going to show you Barnhill's outline. She sent it to me. No, just kidding. I actually made it myself. Okay, so now you see, this is called a reverse outline. You basically read an article and then you structure it. You show what the outline was. And so this is my attempt at making a reverse outline of Just Pushy Enough by Anne Barnhill. Okay? So there's a couple things to notice here. The first thing is that every paper is different. So you don't want to follow some formula in making an outline. Your paper is unique, and you have to make one that's right for your paper. Okay, so the first thing you might notice is that I have part 1, part 2, part 3, and part 3. Oops, part 4, I have a typo. Part 4, okay? So, for example, part 2 has several paragraphs in it. So here's the little symbol that means paragraph. So paragraph 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 are all in one part. So when you start writing longer papers, this is a good way to outline. And probably right now you're not ready for an outline quite this detailed. Like you have to figure out basically how you're going to support your thesis first. But as you revise your outline and make it more complex, you might start doing this, part 2, and then a few paragraphs within part 2. Make sense? Okay, so let's go over it. Part 1, Introduction. Paragraphs 1 to 4, 3 examples from the movies of boundary violations in a dating context that we think are okay. So Barnhill has these examples from romantic comedies. And these examples are a little old now, I admit it. But they're still good. And so notice that the first 4 paragraphs is all just examples to show what kind of things she's talking about. No thesis yet. Paragraph 5, usually violations like this aren't permissible. Paragraph 6, why in fact we tolerate boundary violations like this in romantic movies. So like the guy shows up at the girl's house in the middle of the night and he serenades her or something like that. So this is not her thesis. She's saying why in fact we do find these kinds of boundary violations charming in movies. But then she gets to her thesis in paragraph 7. Probably you don't want to wait that long in your paper. This is a lot. This essay is probably more paragraphs than your essay. Thesis, such violations are okay in order to create a closer relationship. It's okay to fake it till you make it. This is actually, I think, her rough thesis. She's going to make it more refined as she goes on. Paragraph 8 establishes focus on when in dating boundary violations are okay. So she's really telling us, I'm going to focus on explaining to you when boundary violations in dating are okay and when they're not. So all that is kind of like the introductory part instead of the introductory paragraph. So this is something you'll see in longer arguments. Part 2, difference between appropriate and inappropriate boundary violations in dating. So in paragraph 9, she brings up an objection. It's wrong to manipulate people. And then she has a rebuttal. To manipulate and violate boundaries is okay sometimes. Paragraph 10, she has a definition, which you might do in your paper too. Prospective boundary violation, to pretend a boundary isn't there in order to create a closer relationship. Paragraphs 10, 11, 12, and 13, she argues, using examples, that prospective boundary violations are permissible in some cases but not others. So the lesson here for your essay is that you might have an example that's different from yours. So if you're arguing your case is permissible, you might have an example that's kind of related, that's not permissible, and then you explain the difference. So a good argument move in Barnhill. And then part 3, why prospective boundary violations are effective. So in paragraphs 14, 15, 16, and 17, she argues that prospective boundary violations work with human psychology. To me, this is kind of a tangent. I don't know if she really needs this part of her argument. Anyway, she has a concession in paragraph 18. She says that these boundary violations in dating are permissible a lot of the time. However, it's a risky move. And that sounds right. So that's a good concession to make. It could go wrong if you put your hand on that girl's knee during the movie. It might backfire. Okay. So she has a concession there. Part 4, rules for prospective boundary violations. Now her argument is getting more detailed. So paragraphs 19 to 22. Prospective boundary violations in dating are permissible if these rules are followed. Rule 1, Rule 2, Rule 3, Rule 4. So now it's really getting more detailed. And you can review the article to see what the rules are. But she's getting much more refined here in her argument. And then in the conclusion, she comes back to John Cusack in those old movies. Cusack's boundary violations in the movies were permissible because they were prospective boundary violations and they followed the 4 rules. So basically, her thesis is, in dating, if it's a prospective boundary violation, if it fits the definition, and if you follow the 4 rules, then what you're doing is permissible in her view. Okay? So, again, remember, every argument is different. And as you start really making a plan for a long paper, you might have an outline like this. It might get more detailed and you have many, many paragraphs. But for now, your goal is this kind of skeletal outline. This is the rough outline where you have a thesis, you have a narrow question, you decide on background information you need, you decide what your reasons are. This is probably the most important thing for your rough outline right here. How are you going to argue for your thesis? Okay, so you're at the rough outline stage. You might not even be sure about this stuff yet. But for the rough outline, maybe include one idea. Okay? So, I hope this video has been helpful to you. And we'll see you in office hour to talk about your essay.